All right, so big picture, big picture. What we're doing here is we take nonverbal behaviors, facial features, body language, a whole bunch of different types of behaviors. And that's typically how we view people first. We view them by their body language, by their facial expressions, by these other nonverbal cues. And then what we do is we tend to make implicit personality theories about that people or those behaviors. And that's what's going to help us lead to something called attributions. And that's kind of the big picture piece of this unit, attributions. And basically what we're doing in an attribution is we want to identify the reason why someone behaved in a certain way. All right, let me give you an example. Let's say if you were to take this class in person, you would take it at 8 a.m. I'm a morning person, so I like teaching at 8 a.m. And at 8 a.m., what we tend to get is people kind of run in late. Not so much the first week or so, but after that, you start to get people walking in late to class. And so you see someone walk in late. What we have to do is, because we're humans, we like to explain other people's behavior. It gives us a sense of control about the world. So then the question becomes, why did that person walk in late? And whatever answer you come up with, that's the attribution that you make about that person. So for me, if a person walks in late, I guess I have a couple options. Number one is I can say that person is lazy, they're unmotivated. Another option would be, oh, that person, it was snowing out and they had to walk real slow on the sidewalks or else they would slip. Or I can make something like, oh, the person's alarm clock must not have gone off. Whatever reason we come up with, those are the attributions that we make. And what we tend to do is we tend to lump them together. So people can either make what's called dispositional attributions. These are attributions about the person, like the person is lazy. Or we can make situational attributions. So these are external. So for example, the person's alarm clock didn't go off. It's not their fault, not the person. It's the fact that the alarm clock didn't go off. Or if it was the snowing example, they showed up late because it was snowing and they had to walk real slow. It's not their fault. It's not them. They're fine. It's the situation. And that situation is that outside it's snowing and they had to walk real slow. So we have two types of, we can make hundreds of different kinds of attributions, but we tend to lump them into these two categories. Internal, it's the person, or external, it's something outside of the person. All right. Now, what theorists did is social psychology theorists, when they started identifying these two types of attributions, internal versus external, researchers started sitting down and trying to figure out, under what conditions do we make internal and under what conditions do we make external attributions? Like, how does this play out? Is there a way that we can is there a way that we can use theory to predict if someone's going to make an internal or an external attribution? All right. So this is where Kelly came in, Harold Kelly, and he called it his cube. And he called it his cube because what he claimed is that there are three variables you need to make an attribution. And he called it the cube because in his paper, which was lengthy and difficult to work through, in his paper, he actually would draw. Oh, that's terrible. All right, that's a cube. He would draw a cube, and you can see there are 3 planes. And that's why I called it the cube, because there are 3 parts to making an attribution. And you see 3 planes of a cube. That's a terrible cube, by the way. So that's how this works. So let's go through an example real quick so you can see how that works. So let's say that you observe a behavior. Chris's boss, that's my boss, is yelling at me. Now, for my boss, if you don't know who that is, that would be Kathy Kane, our department chair. If you know anything about Kathy Kane, or if you've ever met her, she might be the nicest person in the world. And I don't see her ever yelling at anybody in her life, ever. So this would be very uncharacteristic of her. She just happens to be the psych department chair. Therefore, she happens to be my boss. So let's say then what we have now is we have a situation where you walk up to the psych department and you see her yelling at me. All right. Now what you have to do, because we are because we are figuring out what's going on. You're trying to figure out what's going on. Well, you have to try to figure out. Well, is it why is it that Kathy Kane's yelling at me? Why is it that Chris's boss is yelling at me? And you have to make an attribution, because that will then predict: do you talk to Kathy Kane or not, or do you talk to Chris, me, or not? So the three things that Harold Kelly said about his cube, excuse me, was the first variable's consensus. And consensus asks the question, does everyone act that way? And in this example, that would mean, do you observe other people yelling at Chris? So if you walk up to the psych department, do you see Natalie Goubet, Steve Civi, any other psych professor? Is anyone yelling at? Is everyone else yelling at me, or is it just Kathy Kane? And what you do is you give it a judgment. So you see this and you rate it high or low. All right. If it's high, everyone's yelling at me. If it's low, only Kathy Kane is yelling at me. All right. The second variable is distinctiveness. And that asks the question, does that person, Kathy Kane, does that person act that way everywhere? Right? So low or high. So if it's low, that means it is low distinctiveness. That means it is not specific to Chris. Low distinctiveness means that it is not distinct to me. So what that would mean is that Kathy Kane yells at all employees, not just Chris. If it's high, that means it is distinct to me, right? So that means Kathy Kane only yells at me, high distinctiveness. And then finally is consistency. Does that person, Kathy Kane, act the same way to Chris every time she sees him? All right. So in other words, whenever you are in the psych department or you walk around campus, if you see Kathy Kane and Chris together, if it's high consistency, that means Kathy Kane's going to be yelling at me every single time she sees me. And if it's low consistency, that means that Kathy Kane only yelled at me this one time. All right. So what we have these three variables. And the way I tell my students to kind of remember this is with a combination called CDC. So it's kind of like, CDC. It's consensus, distinctiveness, consistency. And what we do is we use this information to determine is Chris just incompetent or is Kathy Kane mean? All right, so that's what we're doing here. Now, a couple of students in the past have been confused about this. Yes, technically, you need more than one kind of instance to see this. So if you look at something like consistency, you're going to need more than one observation to make this claim. But it's not so far-fetched that this kind of thing happens quicker than you think. All right. So even though you do need the more trials, the merrier, you don't need that many. And we start making our attributions and our judgments. All right. So here's what Kelly said. What Kelly said is so everything has a high-low. And what you do is you look at the pattern of highs and lows together. And what Kelly came up with in his cube was he said, if you're going to make an internal attribution about Kathy Kane, so the boss is a jerk, you need this combination, low, low, high. If it's low, low, high, let's work through what that means. What you look at is you see the boss is only yelling at Chris. It's not distinct to the boss is yelling at Chris. She's the only one doing it. No one else is yelling at me. Low distinctiveness. The boss is yelling at everybody, not just me. And whenever you see the boss and me together, the boss is yelling at me. In other words, the boss is a yeller, aka the boss is a jerk. Low consensus. She's the only one yelling at me. Low distinctiveness. The boss yells at everybody. And if you see this multiple times, the boss is always yelling at me. You must have these three things. Low, low, high for the CDC. Low, low, high. And if you have that combination, just like that, you make an internal attribution. Now, my question to you then is, are you going to approach Kathy Kane if you think she's a jerk? No, you will not. Or you're less likely to. Let's put it that way. Now, Kelly said, what about an external? It must be Chris. It's not Kathy Kane. It's not her. It's not the boss's fault. The boss is a nice person. It must be something external to the boss, i.e. me. It must be me. I'm the situation here. I'm the environment. And he said it's high, high, high all the way across. CDC is high. Think about what that means if you work through this. High means everybody yells at Chris. High consensus. Everyone does it. So everyone in the department yells at me. High distinctiveness. That means Kathy Kane's yelling is distinct to me. So the boss doesn't yell at everybody, just Chris. And high consistency. Every time the boss sees Chris, she yells at him. So if you have high, 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 it's external. It's not Kathy Kane's fault. She's a nice person. It's Chris. It's me. It's the environment. Now, so theoretically, Kelly did a really good job. Kelly was one of the first scientists that really put attributions on the map in terms of this theoretical argument. And his paper, although long and difficult to get through, was really groundbreaking in what it was trying to do. And it was trying to outlay this theoretical reasoning to explain under which circumstances you're going to make an internal versus external attribution. And that was groundbreaking, and it still is to me. Now, I'm a big theory guy. I love theory because theory is so important to the scientific method. The issue that we have with this, that I have with this in particular, is that what happens if you have other combinations? Like, remember, for external, as you see right here, it has to be high, high, high. For internal, it has to be low, low, high. What happens if you have low, 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 or high, low, high, or any other possible combination that exists? We just hit 2 combos. What about the other X numbers of combinations that exist? And Kelly's answer was it's inconclusive. It's inconclusive. And as a theorist, I don't like that explanation. Right? I don't like that explanation because what's going to end up happening here is that all of a sudden our ability to predict kind of goes out the window the second we get away from low, low, high or high, high, high. And although I appreciate Kelly's honesty and his ability to bluntly say, we don't know. If any other combination comes about, we don't know. And I appreciate Kelly's honesty with that. And it takes a really confident scientist to say, I clearly don't know. But in all honesty, we still don't know. But here's what we do know. Any other combination is less clear. And whenever something is less clear, that brings with it more possibility for other variables to explain the effect. Right? For example, in the aggression domain, there's something called hostile attribution bias. And if it's a personality trait, you have it or you don't. And a hostile attribution bias is where people see an ambiguous situation. So let's take an email someone sends you. You don't know their intent, you don't know their emotions, you don't know their sarcasm, so it's ambiguous. And if you have a hostile attribution bias, you're going to read that email and assume the person who sent it is being hostile. When it's an ambiguous situation, if you're high on hostile attribution bias, you're going to assume that anything someone does is going to be with hostile intent. And so it could be the case that whenever you have another combination that isn't high, high, high or low, low, high, any other combination leaves room for personality variables like that, just as an example, to predict or offer extra predictions or extra explanatory power into the process. And that's fine, but Harold Kelly did not account for that, and he really can't. All right? He really can't. All right, before we end this piece of the attributions, what I wanted to show you was this Word document. It's on Moodle, because I want you guys to practice with the cube. So what you'll see here is I have presented several different situations to you. And you have to identify the CDC if it's low or high, and then make an informed decision. This is the answer key. The answers are highlighted in yellow. I have another version that just says attribution practice, where it's not highlighted, so you can practice with this. And once again, it's on Moodle for you right here. Here's the practice, and here's the key. And I want you guys to really spend your time working through Kelly's cube, because it's not always the easiest thing to work through without practice.